So I'm talking about the preservation of a Cambrian system. The older rocks are, the more chance it's got to be eroded and less chance it's going to be existing today. So I want to talk about why the Cambrian rocks are preserved, and we've got to look at the system that's allowed that to happen, and then I'll look at some of the costs that come with having it preserved, which are through deep weathering. So this is a diagram from Richard Sillitoe. One of the reasons he's a world guru on porphyry systems, he obviously spends his brain power thinking about the porphyry systems rather than drawing diagrams. But the diagram's good enough, it serves its purpose. What it's showing here is the age of preserved porphyries in the Pacific. And we're part of the Pacific, or we were. Most of the porphyries are quite young, particularly in the west. They get a bit older on the eastern, sort of Andean side. Right down here, there's some old ones. Old systems can be preserved, dreams can come true. And the interesting thing about this one is this 441 is the Macquarie Arc. It's the Ordovician Arc just outboard of our Cambrian-Stavely Arc. So we're all in the same Tasmanides fold belt system, so if you can preserve a world-class system once, why not twice? So why the system is old and preserved comes back to the regional story that we presented this morning, and that we have an arc that's initially in rollback being formed on a thin ribbon, on a thin continental ribbon, against oceanic regions either side. Here it's more oceanic, and here is essentially hyperextended back to the mantle. So in the deformation that we see when it gets shortened up, after the delimierium, which we see in the seismic, what happens is the regions on either side overthrust the arc because they were thinner and weaker, and the arc essentially stayed low grade and underthrust, while the other regions overthrust and buried down under them rather than uplifted in its own right and eroded away. So that's the fundamental reason, this control of being on a thin continental margin that allowed it to be preserved. So as the regions overthrust, they start to erode onto it, and that continues through, start off with the Nagoon group and then into the Grampians group time even. Now all this is occurring on this fundamental plate boundary here, where we've got thin Proterozoic continental margin of Australia with this last little ribbon piece, and out here we've got these accreted Phanerozoic oceanic terrains of the Tasmanides. So a fundamental plate tectonic boundary here, and this is one of the big themes in the new Uncover for Australian mineral systems, where you have fundamental plate boundaries, the lithospheric architecture. So along those margins that big mineral systems can tend to form. Just a couple of diagrams here, some big picture data sets that help explain this massive plate boundary. Why it's so important. This is the AusLAMP magnetotellurics data, just looking, I can't explain all the details of it, I just want to show you the patterns. This is still being written up with Jerry at the moment. So this just looks at the electrical domains and the way the natural electricity is flowing through the crust. Here is the boundary we're talking about. This is the Stavely Zone here, so you've got the Proterozoic crust and its lithosphere, and the Cambrian and younger oceanic crust and its lithosphere. Completely different. This is a slice at 40 kilometres down, right in that sort of mantle lower crust interface. You can just see completely different pattern there. Don't worry about why at the moment, just see that it's different along this plate tectonic boundary. The next one is a heat flow map that we compiled in Victoria recently, ostensibly for renewable energy, but heat flow is a fundamental geology data set, and we finally collected enough data to make a map out of it, and we can see the same thing here. There's the boundary transcribed between the Proterozoic and the younger Tasmanide rocks. Heat flow is generally about 7-ish around the world. You can see the younger Cambrian rocks tend to be hotter, and the older Proterozoic rocks tend to be colder. Because the older rocks are, the more radioactivity has been decayed out of them. So everything's telling us we've got this fundamental boundary here. Oh, too fast. Okay, the next thing is looking at uplift along this boundary. This is fission track data, so I just concentrate on this little piece of rock thin section here first. What that is all these little marks in the rock are where uranium atoms, natural radioactivity is sitting in the rock. As the atom naturally decays and undergoes fission, the alpha particle flies off and it literally smashes through the rock lattice, damage into the rock lattice. That's why you don't keep radioactive rocks in your pockets, put them on the bench. What happens if the rock's hot, greater than 60 degrees, there's enough thermal energy for the lattice to self-anneal and heal itself. So if rocks are down deep and hot, deeper than about 60 degrees, and you just whip it up to the surface, there won't be any fission tracks in it. If the rocks come up near the surface and been sitting there for a long time, because of radioactive half-lives like a fixed process, the longer it's been cooled at the surface, the more fission tracks you get. And in the past, there was a limited survey done here back in 1992 by the labs at Melbourne Uni. They looked along here, and what happened is in the western half of this boundary, the rocks are all quite old in the fission tracks, but these rocks had come to the surface and been cooled younger. So they said, turn it into a model. This half, so across onto the Tasmanite side, had been uplifted by a couple of kilometres in the Cretaceous times Australia and Antarctica pulled apart, and all the material was eroded off on this side and sent into the Otway Basin. So even if there had been porphyries on this side, like the Blue Star, they'd have been eroded and gone, but the ones on the west side would be preserved. They only had a little bit of data down in the south. What happened up in the north? Was it all equally preserved, or had some been more uplifted or less uplifted? So out of all the new drilling, we collected samples and did more new fission track through the same lab again. And what we see here is an early history. They all look the same, so it's interesting. It's similar everywhere. So if the porphyry horizon's preserved down here and it's the same everywhere, the assumption is the porphyries will be preserved there. The early history, what this shows here is the 60-degree cooling. So below here, all the fission tracks are annealing. We know in the Cambrian the rocks came to the surface from the rock control. But what's happened then is it all got buried by the Grampians and got so hot that it's reset all the fission tracks. That early history isn't from the fission tracks, that's from the geological control. What we then see is all the rocks just gradually coming back to the surface and cooling through the 60 degrees at about 300 million years. 300 million years ago. And so they've been sitting in the top, within 2 kilometres of the surface for the last 300 million years, nothing happened to them, which explains why the system's still preserved here today for us. And so that preservation brings some cost with it. It's great that it's there, that hasn't been eroded away. You can start mechanically eroding it in open pits instead. But the cost of that is that it's been deeply weathered because it's been there so long. This was a clay pit where the rocks are so weathered it's back to the coal-analytic unreactive clays, which are great for making bricks. About 30 metres deep, as Cameron talked about this morning. And this is one of the drill holes drilled by North nearby, and you can see it's 30 metres deep. What they were drilling down to is get fresh rock for geochem samplings, because all this stuff above is totally depleted. If you sample here, there's going to be no copper anomalies in that. All the copper's been leached and depleted and gone elsewhere. And just finishing off now, this is over our type locality of Thursday's Gossan. Here's the original RAB holes they drilled, and red's the little copper anomalies. So they got copper up here near the surface, but in these holes where it's more deeply weathered over the centre of the porphyry because of the acid leaching and the fracturing, they drill down, the drill holes bogged down in the wet waterlogged clays, and the samples came back with no copper. That's because it's all leached, it's all gone. What you do, of course, is you're going to drill your anomalies, so you back the rig in under the piece here and drill underneath to see what's there, and luckily they snag some of the sort of porphyry vein systems on the edge of the system rather than in the guts of the system. So when you're drilling, beware this problem. And just to finish off, that copper's got to go somewhere, right? It's depleted here, but it's going to go somewhere else. And most of the systems here, we've seen that copper enriched into supergene near the surface. That's great, because if you're going to do a big block cave or deep open pit, it's good to have some supergene near the surface in a shallow pit that gives you some extra financial boost up front for your feasibility studies to get the whole process rolling. So I'll just take this diagram now, and what I'll superimpose is like the map view of the later work by Stavely showing how it's going. So this is the copper resource here around the edge, and this is the depleted zone in the middle. So if I just go back again, cross-section, and I'll fade. So the guts of the system's over here where it was all dead in the early geochemistry. Come back. No surprise that Stavely Minerals' first deep holes are sitting over the system because we know it's there now. But around the edge of the system, you can see here we've actually already got a copper resource, not from the primary system, but in the secondary system. And most of them seem to have it, as Rob talked about earlier. That's good news from that deep weathering and its preservation. And just to finish off, this is our north-south cross-section here along through that red zone. So what you can see, the top 10, 20 metres is depleted, and then all the oxidised material is leached down back into the top of the reduced zone and redeposited as secondary enriched sulphides, chalcocite. So that's the end of it here. So good news in it's preserved, but it also makes it a little bit more difficult for you in terms of your initial exploration. But part of that difficulty with the depletion is it's then been enriched into chalcocite blankets in places as well. So it's all up to you now.